So the final bit really of this module, Sci B1. Last little bit goes into the biological section. So it's section A, and you've got the approaches, and you've also got biological approach, and this goes in the biological. So it's not your gender section. Okay, it's the last little bit of the biological. And what we're going to talk about here are things like genetic transmission. We're going to talk about the twin studies, adoption studies, and selective breeding, as well as last little pieces of information that apply to this. So we've covered some of this already. We've talked about genotype and phenotype, but you'll see on here that we've got definitions. So genotype, individual's genetic makeup. Okay, so the individual set of genes of an individual. Make sure you say the individual. Phenotype are the observable characteristics shown by that individual. And we really, for psychology, we want to tag on this little bit. Affected by both their genes and their environment. Okay, so because we're talking psychology, you need to have that little bit. This bit I think you cover in biology, but for psychology we need to tag this bit on. Alright, so it is important. So, and I go on to say every cell, except for the sex cells, has 23 pairs of chromosomes, and a gene from each pair comes from each parent, and you probably remember this from biology. Each gene is dominant or recessive. Okay. A recessive gene doesn't influence the physical characteristics, but it does if you get both pairs, both gene pairs are recessive, and then obviously we will see that characteristic shown. What have we got here? As we've said, the genetic makeup of an individual, the genotype interacts with the environment to get the phenotype. Right, you will need to have one example. I mean, we can use a kind of vague example like this with the identical twins. You probably know some identical twins. Sometimes they've got, so monozygotic twins, I'll explain that in a moment, identical twins. But you can have a situation where one of them is a little bit stronger. You know, it could be that one is a little bit taller, whatever, depending on things like their diet, etc. The example I think you should learn, which is a very good example, is this with PKU. Phenylketonuria. Okay, it comes from a double recessive pair, gene pair, which means that it will show itself. And what do you need to know? It causes a deficiency in an enzyme. You don't need to know this, but what will happen in that child is that they will have severe learning difficulties. Let's just highlight this a little bit. Okay, so severe learning difficulties for that individual. The thing is, if you discover that quickly enough, and it's addressed early enough, then actually you can alter the diets, give them a special diet which is low in phenylalanine, and what that means is the child will develop normally. Okay, so it will not show any of these difficulties, these learning difficulties, but it will need to have this special diet for all its life. So really important, because what you're showing there is this genetic influence which could result in really severe learning difficulties for this child, but we can address that. We can address that with environmental influences, and that means that the child will not show any of those difficulties, which is incredible. Okay, but it has to be spotted early enough, and I believe that that's one of the tests that they give for children in this country when they're born, just a quick blood test to find out whether they've got this disorder or not. Okay, so do learn this one. The PKU example is a good one. Oops, I'm trying to do that. Yeah, PKU is a good example. Okay, so what else do we need to know? Right, we're going to have a look at some of these. We need to know how we go about finding out these nature-nurture results. How much is nature and how much is nurture? Okay, so we've got twin studies, family, adoption, and selective breeding. Let's have a look. So twin studies, right, we refer to MZ twins and DZ twins, monozygotic, which are identical, and DZ non-identical. And here I have a little image to show you. So what do we mean by monozygotic? And this is an opportunity for you to draw this on your box, on your handout. Monozygotic just means it's from one fertilized egg. Okay, so the ovum splits, and therefore you get identical twins, and you've got all the genetic makeup in the nucleus of this egg, and that splits to form two separate eggs. All right, but they have exactly the same genetic makeup, so they will be identical. Dizygotic is just the same as siblings, but they're just being developed. all right, cooked at the same time, as it were, all right. So basically, you've got 2 eggs that are fertilized by 2 different sperm, and I have, I've actually made this one a bit bigger because they are different. It's just to illustrate, and I could have been a bit more fancy and coloured them in or something like that, just to show that they are different. So it's just the same as you and your siblings, except that these are being born at the same time. So in other words, it's only going to have 50% the same genetic makeup. Okay, so you can draw that on your handout, and that covers you for these little bits here. Let's just take that off. So moving on down, why do we bother studying twins? What are we supposed to find out from this? What is the information? What use is it to us? Okay, so let's have a look and see what I've got and what I want you to write down. Right, you've got here, you've got your AS text, which you know is quite useful in places. It certainly gives you a little bit of an understanding. And I've said here, can you make a note of the rationale, the logic behind why we study MZ twins and DZ twins? Okay, I'm actually going to explain that for you and what I want, but you can get this from the text instead and pause, etc. if you want. So we need to know this term, concordance. Concordance, what does that mean? Right. You may be familiar with this already, but it's the extent that, for example, twins have similar characteristics. Okay, discordant is the opposite of that. It's how different they are. Concordance is how similar they are in certain traits, right? Certain characteristics. We could mean behaviours there. So, for example, it could be how similar they are in terms of their intelligence, in terms of their personality, in terms of their sexuality, in terms of all sorts of different characteristics, okay, and often we're looking at things like intelligence, and we've already mentioned discordant there. Okay, so research measuring the heritability of intelligence, in other words, how similar, that's all this means, how much intelligence is inherited, all right, has used twin studies and measured intelligence using very standardized tests of intelligence. We refer to them usually as IQ tests, okay. You may well need one study in a lot more detail that, you know, if you're asked to describe one study demonstrating biological influences, for example, on behaviour, and let's say it's worth 4 or 5 marks, I'm going to talk you through this study. Remember, they are asking more these days. They're asking you, how would we go about that? How would we investigate? And tell us about the method. Okay, so that's this section really. However, they can still ask you, describe one study. So what do we know? This is the Bouchard study, okay, or you could say the Minnesota twin study. And as we've said already, it's a twin study. And what they're looking for is how much of a characteristic like intelligence, and certainly other traits as well, psychological traits, how much of that is determined genetically, okay, so biologically, and environmentally through nurture. So nature versus nurture. So what did they do? They did a longitudinal study. A longitudinal study is a study that takes the same people over time, over a long period of time. And here they were investigating MZ and DZ twins. Some of them reared together and some of them apart. And they had to do, what did they have to do? They had to do intelligence tests, IQ tests. Okay, and what they then did was they measured those, they correlated them. So that's quite useful for you to know as well, that it was a correlation. Okay. So the method, they would investigate MZ, monozygotic, that's identical, and non-identical twins, given them some particular tests. For example, in this case, they were investigating intelligence, so IQ tests. These twins were, some of them were reared together, was brought up together, some of them were living apart, and they would then correlate the scores. If intelligence is inherited, you would expect the MZ twins reared together to be very, very similar. So we're saying if this is a biological cause, if your intelligence is has caused biologically, and in fact there was something that one of you sent me today on this very fact, how much our GCSE, our A-level scores come from biology, you know, from our nature, how much of it from nurture. There is some information, in fact I might try and copy that on at the end of this. So how much of that is inherited? And we would say that MZ twins, they've got exactly the same genes, they've got the same genotype. That means if if it's a biological cause, we would expect them to be, well, to be honest, we would expect them to have 100% concordance. All right, just get your heads around that for a minute. Pause it for a minute if you need to. But we're saying if it's a biological cause, if it's caused by nature, right, in your genes, your intelligence, if it's caused by nature, then if you've got identical twins, they should have the same IQ. All right, so that's what we're looking for. We would expect them also to be higher, that concordance, that similarity, we would expect to be higher than DZ twins who are reared together. So here we're talking about twins reared together. Why is it important that they're reared together? Because we obviously we want to minimize the extraneous variables, we want to minimize the other variables that could affect them, so the environment. So what you're comparing is MZ reared together to see, you know, how similar they are. We would expect in those situations for them to be 100% concordant, okay? And we would expect that to be much higher than those DZ twins reared together, because they've got 50% different genes, all right? And actually, we would expect the MZ twins reared together to be more concordant than those reared apart. Or, in fact, I should say we're investigating that, and we want to know the ones together. Are they more, or are they more concordant together or apart? If they're more concordant together, then again we're just saying that's kind of nature. But it is interesting to see what happens when they're reared apart, because that would suggest that environment also plays a part. So in this particular study, what were the results? The results were that the MZ twins reared together had greater similarity of intelligence, 0.86, all right, a concordance, correlation concordance level of 0.86, all right, which, as you know, is a very, very strong positive correlation. So as one twin increased in IQ, so did the other. And MZ twins reared apart, they were more concordant, 0.86 compared with 0.72. So these guys are still pretty close. They are, they correlate highly, but their scores correlate highly, but it's not quite the same as those reared together. All right, and then comparing those with the DZ twins reared together was just 0.60. So this tells us really that there is a strong genetic component in something like intelligence. And I've got here, it seemed that intelligence could be biological, i.e. inherited. However, if it's just biological, we would expect this 100% concordance. In other words, intelligence should be the same in both twins, but that's not what happened here. Now, I had asked you up here to explain the rationale of this. All right, and the rationale is that we want to look at these together and compare them. MZ twins reared together, right? And we're going to assume, because they've got the same biological component, they've got exactly the same genotype, then if inheritance or whatever factor, whatever characteristic you're looking at, if it's caused biologically through the genes, then we would expect a very high concordance level, okay, because they have identical genes. So really, ideally, what you're looking for is 100% concordance, right, full concordance between one twin and the other. Actually, the evidence doesn't find that usually, as we've just seen here, right. 0.86 is very high similarity, but it's not perfect. So that is always going to tell us that there must be some environmental influence as well. So what else have we got down here? Okay, so here we've got a little bit, however, it's just biological, expect 100% concordance. So in any sort of question you get on twin studies, you're really looking to use some of these keywords. You need to really be talking about concordance levels. You would need to refer to MZ versus DZ twins. You should be including nature and nurture, and environmental versus biological factors. Okay, and talking about any characteristic, behavior, something like that. Right, now I've put here extension work. Now some of you might be interested in this, particularly if you've already got your textbooks open. There is other evidence for the genetic basis of behavior from twin studies. And actually, in the past, we've referred to things like homosexuality. I know some of you are quite interested in that with the gender issue, the gender topic. A lot of you ask, questions about where that comes from. etc., etc. Well, you might be very interested in that particular research that's in your textbook. It's on page 37. Okay, and they looked at males to see how concordant they were for homosexuality, MZ twin boys versus DZ twin boys. You could always put that one in as well. Okay, that one could be used instead of the Bouchard one, but it's just that if we need one with a lot of detail, the Bouchard one is very relevant. So we also should just have something on evaluating those twin studies. Much more likely to be asked for evidence about them, but it's worth you having a little bit of some sort of discussion available, right? Something that you can comment on about these twin studies. So what's great about them is they give you a natural experiment. Okay, we could not manipulate that in the lab, obviously. You can't, you know, deprive a twin from another twin deliberately. You can't take a child away from its parents deliberately to see what happens. But we can find this situation where we have had twins who have been separated at birth, etc., etc. And so we can, you know, we can use this information. So it does provide us with a good natural experiment to see the contribution of nature over nurture. All right, so with the traits, as I've already mentioned, intelligence, sexual orientation, things like that. Problem is, or well, one problem, our first problem really is that when we talk about these children, these twins who are reared apart, actually in reality, when we do find those children, a lot of this data, we would say, how much apart are they? Because in reality, what happens, particularly in you know, in certain cultures, one twin is taken away but given to or looked after by another member of the same family. So yes, they're in a different environment, but how different is that? It's probably going to be quite similar. So that is a bit of an issue. I think the one to use is this one, really, if you need just one. A lot of the data has used DZ twins versus MZ twins. Now, I don't know whether you spotted this, or whether you can think what the problem is without me saying it, but here, MZ twins are always going to be identical. Okay, why? Because they've got the same genes. So you're going to have two boys or two girls. DZ twins, of course, it doesn't work like that. And the data has used twins who are separate, you know, who are different, males and female twins. And the trouble is that and so you're comparing DZ against MZ, but actually you're comparing so much more with these DZ, unless you're using male twins here with male twins here, or female here with female here. Okay, because if you're using a mixture of DZ twins, a boy and a girl, they've got very different environments. So you've got massive confounding variables in there. You're not just saying these are twins versus twins, okay, and it's just their genes are different. Actually, there's a whole load of stuff that comes with being a male or female. Okay, very different experiences. So actually, there's more to it than that, and sometimes the data doesn't show that. It doesn't reflect that. It doesn't make that clear. And here, even with twins brought up in the same home, all right, we can have very different experiences. Right, I know twins who have, you know, told me that even though they are twins, they've experienced very different things. And you know, we certainly have had twins in the school, and some twins, even as I speak today, who have been very open about the fact that their experiences have been very different, and that has made them different people. And that can be identical twins as well as non-identical twins, so MZ or even DZ twins. Okay, so we just assume that the ones brought up together, or we're assuming that they're exactly the same, you know, they've got the same experiences. Actually, they haven't. They've got different life experiences as well. Maybe, you know, quite similar, but still different. So that's twin studies. Right, let's move on to adoption studies. Right, why are adoption studies going to be important? What is the rationale behind that? What are we interested in? Okay, so what are we comparing? Again, you can have a look at your textbook, but I'm just going to explain this, and I'd like you to just jot this down. What you're doing when you're comparing, when you're using adoption studies, is you're comparing an adopted child with biological parents and adoptive parents. Okay, and what you're looking for is, is this adopted child more similar to their biological parents that they left behind, or more similar to their adoptive parents that they now live with? And obviously, whoever they're more similar to, that will tell us whether nature or nurture has been dominant in whatever particular characteristic you're looking at. So if it's intelligence, you're going to compare the child's intelligence with their biological parents, the parents who made them, if you like, and you're going to compare them with the parents who have raised them. And if they're more similar to their biological parents, that implies, it doesn't prove anything, remember, it just implies that their biology, in other words, their genes, are responsible, or more responsible, for their intelligence than their environment. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. So once again, you're going to be you're going to be talking about what you're comparing. We're also using concordance rates again. Okay, so these are correlations. And so you're going to be using the same keywords. You're talking about nature, nurture. You're talking about biology versus environment. You're talking about correlations and concordance rates between the child and either, in this case, biological or adoptive parents. Okay, so that's the rationale, that's the information I want you to get down here with that space. Okay, and then I've asked you to look at one of the studies. There are a few studies, and in fact, actually, I've said use one of the studies, and I've left a space here for intelligence. Page 38, adoption studies, and summarise in terms of this. What is the aim? What were they doing? And I would say that with the aim, this was with intelligence, maybe I've got here the aim to investigate similarity in their verbal or cognitive ability between the adopted child and the biological and adoptive parents. Okay, so maybe to look at intelligence levels, again, between the adopted child and their biological parents or their adoptive parents. So you're looking at correlations, you're looking at concordance rates between them. Okay, method, let's say we could say with the Minnesota study, for example. With the Minnesota study, if we're using intelligence, the black children from a low socioeconomic background were adopted into white middle-class families with at least one of their own biological children. Okay, so we can put the method in there. What were the results? At first, what was interesting with the Minnesota study, at first the black children were more similar to their biological parents. Okay, and we've got some data there, 0.43, so quite a low concordance compared to the adoptive parents, which was 0.29, so very low. Okay, but then what they found was that children showed intellectual similarities. Okay, they ended up actually being quite similar to their new siblings, so the black children with their new white siblings. Now, what's interesting about this, we can put in this box, the conclusion, etc. It must be due to environment. Okay, there must be environment actually playing a role there. But the only thing was that remember, these were wealthier families than the families they'd come from, and therefore they would be actually having a very stimulating environment compared to their biological parents, and that we know would make a difference. Although, again, it's showing it is showing us environment over, it's showing us nurture over nature. Right, so it does show that nurture is actually playing a part in intelligence levels. So we've got that. With the problems with adoption studies, it is that really, that most of them are going to be, it's difficult because the environments are different. Okay, so we're not just looking at this biological factor, but the environments are very different, and we're not comparing like with environments. So we've got a problem with the fact that we've got a very different environment, and with these usually wealthier parents who have an enriched environment which would influence the children. Okay. And then we go on to selective breeding. Right, selective breeding, key words for this. There's an actual answer you can learn, and that is this: that it is the artificial selection of males and females for a particular trait or characteristic. Okay, so artificially selecting a male and a female of whatever species you want, right, whatever animal, and you've chosen them for the trait, whatever it happens to be, okay, intelligence or, I don't know, gentleness or passivity or whatever it happens to be, okay, or you know, in the case of farmers, for good meat or whatever it is, good milk. Okay, so you select them and then you breed them over successive generations. Successive means one after the other. Alright, so successive generations. What's the advantage of this method? Well, it's great because you can select a particular trait. Okay, you select what you want. You handpick the trait. And we also know that we can breed. For example, if we're looking at and investigating something like that with mice or rats, well, they breed like rats and rabbits. Okay, they breed really, really quickly. And therefore, you've got a very short gestation period. It means a very short breeding period. And it means you can breed these generations really very quickly. So even in a year, you can have successive generations, depending on what species is that you're looking at. Obviously, there's the ethics of it. A lot of people think, well, that's fine if you're just breeding rats. You can look at this, and people don't have too many hang-ups about you manipulating animals like rats or mice. All right, not in the same way as higher order animals. So people don't find it so offensive, and therefore one can argue the ethics are a little bit better, I suppose, from that. We can also have lovely control. So you can manipulate their environment. You can give them exactly the same environment. If you keep a rat in a box or whatever it is, so you've got exactly the same environment. It's nicely controlled, and therefore all you're changing is the genes. Basically, you're just breeding for that particular gene. So lovely bit of control. Right, this study is very worth having. We're going to use this in year 13 as well. Okay, the Tyrants Study. Now, the Tyrants Study, sometimes in your different textbooks, sometimes it's spelt T-Y-R and sometimes it's spelt T-R-Y, Tryon. Okay, so there's obviously a typing error with one of the texts, so you'll see that in both places. But anyway, I'm going to call it Tyron. Fascinating study, really useful, and it's on selective breeding. And what do we want to say about this? It's page 38, 39 of your textbook, if you want that. And what's the aim? The aim is to investigate whether genes have influenced learning in rats. So what did Tyron do, or Tyron? They trained rats to run in a complex maze, right? And they selected the quickest rats and the slowest rats. And the idea was that they were going to breed for between the quickest and the slowest. Okay, so they bred bright, all right, maze bright, they called them maze bright rats, with other very bright maze bright rats. In other words, to get other maze bright rats. And they also bred for the dullest ones as well, the slowest. Okay, they bred them over several generations. The DV was the number of errors made and their speed. All right, so the results were that the maze bright learned to run faster and with fewer errors. And so what they conclude from that is that that learning, that intelligence was inherited. It was heritable. That means inherited, or able to be inherited, and it was therefore genetic. All right, so we're down here now with the results and the conclusion. Really interesting, because what that was showing was that you could breed for something like intelligence. Now the only thing is, what was really interesting was this guy Cooper did a follow-up study, and what they did was they put maze dull rats, so the dim ones, all right, the slow ones, the dim ones, they put them in two different environments. Some of them they put in impoverished, boring environments, and some of them they put in really stimulating environments. And actually what they found was that the maze dull ones soon became maze bright and made the same number of errors. Okay, so in other words, what that was showing, it's really, really actually very important, was that the environment was also important for intelligence. And the implications for that, for us as a society, is, you know, fantastic, because that implies that we can take individuals, children perhaps, who aren't performing well, and give them environmental stimulation, improve their environmental conditions, and we can improve their intelligence. Okay, so really powerful stuff. So I've got down here, what other evaluator points can you make about these animal studies? Well, these were animals, and therefore the problem is that they are limited in generalizing. Okay, you can't generalize from those animal studies, or some people will argue that, because although we have a lot of similarities, actually we are different, right? We have other thought processes. We have a sense of self. We have all sorts of differences. We have society that influences us, etc., etc., emotions, okay, motivations that influence us, and therefore we are different to animals. So we are limited in generalizing. And at the bottom of your sheet, we've got a little summary here: strengths of selective breeding, short gestation, as I mentioned, the ethics, good control, weaknesses, problems of generalizing, and actually we should also comment there are still ethical issues, right? As I speak today, there's been stuff in the press about animal rights and research going on in different universities on animal research, and whether it's ethically whether it's ethically sound, and whether we should be questioning it. So, there are these, just because they're animals doesn't mean that we should abandon them and we shouldn't consider the ethics. We do. We have a very strict code of practice, and we need to make sure we stick to that code. Okay, so there are still ethical issues with it. I've also included some model answers for you. Okay, why do we use twins? Why do we use adoption studies and selective breeding? Some information there, so have a look at that. Okay, and at the bottom I've just put this link that somebody sent me today. One of you sent me this very interesting article on the BBC News, and hopefully by the time you read this, this will still be up there. So have a look at that. It's all about nature nurture, and it's useful for you. Okay, so remember, this information needs to go in your biological section. It is something you'll see on the past questions of approaches, that they do refer to twin studies, selective breeding, things like that. So don't forget that. Okay, and then after Christmas, we're going to have a little test on your gender section and your research section. We won't be doing approaches just for the moment, but we will be going over this. We'll do some exercises on this and some work based on this. Okay, so make sure you've got that. Okay, guys, thank you.